All right, hello and happy, what day is it today? It's Friday today. Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
it's Friday.
Happy Friday. Welcome to
Thank you.
PatristiCast. I'm here today with the wonderful Dr. Robin Darling Young, who's assistant or associate professor of church history at the Catholic University of America.
Associate, but yeah.
Associate, okay, not assistant, associate. And you specialize in early Christianity, patristics, monastic studies, and for quite a while now, you've been working on this interesting figure we're going to talk about today, Evagrius Ponticus. So welcome to PatristiCast, Dr. Young.
Thank you. I'm very happy and privileged to be here.
So you got your PhD from the University of Chicago, correct?
That's correct.
What was your dissertation?
Well, my dissertation was actually on the Patriarchate of Severus of Antioch, which
So
lasted from 512 to 518.
Okay. And you have spent then, so Antioch, southeastern, modern day Turkey, right? The southeastern, right along the Syrian border, correct?
Southwestern, yeah.
Southwestern Turkey.
Yes.
Antioch
Antioch is on the coast.
It's on the coast. That's right. Okay. So you've also done quite a bit of work in Syriac Christianity. How did you come around to start working on this really fascinating figure, Evagrius?
Okay, I will tell you. I have to add, by the way, that as an undergraduate, I went to Mary Washington College, which was then an all-women's college, and I was drawn into this field by the lectures of Elizabeth Clark, who was my teacher and whom I met 50 years ago. And I'm very fond of her, and so I knew I was going to go in the direction of early Christianity, but I actually thought I was going to do Augustine because Latin was a language I had learned in youth, and that seemed to be fitting. But I got to Chicago, and Chicago has an Oriental Institute, and we got some lectures from a very unique scholar there named Arthur Wöbus, and Wöbus kindled my interest in Syriac Christianity. And then I was persuaded to work on the Patriarchate of Severus of Antioch, who of course was a very highly trained Greek rhetor and sort of philosopher who became bishop of Antioch there. So his sermons were originally in Greek, but left over in Syriac. I mean, translated into Syriac, and very little of the Greek remains. So I sort of went off in the Syriac direction, and then I came to Washington. After my graduate studies, well, before I finished my PhD, and I worked at Wesley Theological Seminary, which is a Methodist seminary on the northwest side of town. But because I loved Syriac and wanted to keep up with it, I made contact with people at the Institute for Christian Oriental Research at Catholic U. And that was Sidney Griffith, mainly, who was working on Ephraim at the time. And I sat in his Ephraim seminars whenever possible, and then ultimately came to Catholic U. And I had to, but my position was in Greek patristics. Okay. So I taught in Greek patristics. I was really interested in Syriac. I had left Latin. I had decided not to pursue the Latin route, while in graduate school.
Probably wise.
Sorry?
Probably wise.
Well, actually, I was going to circle back and say I had always had in mind to do something with Evagrius because I was introduced to him in a course by Bernie McGinn called The Monastic Way. And I read the earlier translation of his work, the PatristiCast, and I thought it was really fascinating, but didn't really get around to doing anything with it until Sidney Griffith and I decided to teach a course together on Evagrius. And then when we moved beyond the practicos into the gnostikos, then I really started to get interested in it. At the same time, I was in a Clement of Alexandria reading group with Joseph Trigg and a scholar at Virginia who is unfortunately recently deceased, Judith Kovacs, and we read Clement together. So I was getting into the Alexandrian tradition. Okay, I can put a period on the end of that. Sorry.
That's okay. So, okay, you're situated quite nicely then with your training to study Evagrius, because from what I understand, his works are extant today in Greek, some of them in Greek, but also Syriac and Armenian are the three probably big ones. Is that right?
Also Arabic. Yes.
Oh, Arabic, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the practicos and the gnostikos, so that you're talking about his monastic trilogy, right? Which is capped off by the Kephalaia Gnostikos, or Kephalaia Gnostica. So
yes.
Talk about that trilogy a little bit. What's Evagrius up to there?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Thank you.
I'm glad.
It's really, we really know very little about his life and what he was trying to accomplish in it, although I think it's pretty certain that he spent the last 13 years of his life in a monastery in Egypt. So my own current thinking, and I think those who work with me on the Gnostic Trilogy team, which is producing a translation of this thing, I think we are coming around to the idea that he was producing works of Christian philosophy his entire adult life, and that in Egypt, he retrofitted them to the monastic situation, which is why you find so much Stoic philosophy, more virtue ethics basically, and Platonic philosophy in the Kephalaia Gnostica and in other works of his. So, and I came to this view also working on his scholia, which are interpretations of the wisdom books in the Old Testament, and they show no connection with the monastic life at all. So they are a work of exegesis, possibly composed in the 370s or maybe late 360s, early 370s. That's just a guess. So we began to look at him more broadly as someone involved in the conversation among philosophers in the third and fourth quarters of the 4th century. And as you know, this is a very heated exchange. Because we have on the one hand the Christian philosophers like Basil and certainly Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa and others, but he would have been familiar with those. And then we have the Hellenic philosophers like Themistius, Julian the Emperor, but before them, the great student of Plotinus.
Porphyry.
Thank you, Porphyry. And Porphyry, I think we have discovered in working through the Syriac of the Kephalaia Gnostica that there are direct responses to Porphyry.
Really?
Yes. So, yes, it's not like discovering nuclear fission, I agree, but it is really an interesting discovery because it puts Evagrius in the context of those generations of Platonic philosophers who were arguing with each other on very closely held territory. And they were arguing about maybe two things: how to live and how to contemplate.
Okay. So that's very interesting, because Evagrius, his legacy, he's mostly treated as a monastic theorist, not a scholar, not a biblical scholar. What you're describing, though, is prior to his monastic life. So he's born he's born in Pontus, which is the northern, like the northeastern coast of Turkey, right?
Yes.
And he gets involved. He's a friend of the Cappadocians, if I'm not mistaken. So Basil and the two Gregories. Now he gets caught up in some kind of a romance controversy, doesn't he? And then he goes from there to a monastery in Roman Palestine. In was it on the Mount of Olives? Is that where he was? Or
Yes, he somehow meets up with Melania.
Melania, who is Rufinus's friend and patroness.
Right, friend and companion and bankroller. Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Well, we get these, if I may, we
Yeah.
get these details from Palladius,
Oh, okay.
who, as you remember, also wrote a defense of John Chrysostom.
Mm-hmm.
So Palladius is a person who studied with Evagrius in Egypt, or claims to be. I believe that. And he was a proponent of those people associated with Melania and Evagrius, John of Lycopolis,
Mm-hmm.
and the intellectualist ascetics of northern Egypt.
Okay. Like Didymus the Blind, is that?
Yes, and Didymus is absolutely. Didymus is an older, would be an older member of this, what we could loosely describe as a circle.
Mm-hmm.
But Palladius is writing in the 5th century, and I believe that he has cast Evagrius as someone who has a sudden conversion experience from a dangerous love affair, and that was what propelled him to be a monk. But I'm not so sure that Palladius hasn't presented this in a rather romantic fashion, and that Evagrius instead left Constantinople because he didn't no longer fit in with court life there, especially after Gregory Nazianzus left.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that makes me say this about Palladius is that Palladius is interested in being an apologist for a certain kind of monk, but he is not a great historian. And he, for instance, knows very little except rumors about Ephraim the Syrian. But he puts those rumors in to portray Ephraim in a certain way, which is basically makes him seem favorable, will cast him in a favorable light to his readers. And I think this is because in the 420s, we're beginning to get some pushback against the monastic movement. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole like separate discussion. Evagrius gets preserved, though, I think, as a monastic writer by monks who realize that his program of philosophy, which is a philosophy of action and a philosophy of contemplation or observation, theoria is his word for it. I think that the monks realize that this is a very fitting kind of program for training in a life of monastic scholarship, which is certainly beginning at that period. Yep. And they preserve him. There were Greek copies of the original Greek of the Kephalaia Gnostica available probably until Justinian in 553, which is when you get the condemnations of Origenism, and that they continued to copy him. And as the monastic movement got established more formally in Syria and in Armenia at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century, those monastic scribes and translators were eager to translate Evagrius. So, for instance, we have the Practicos and the Gnosticos, the first 2 books, were translated in the 5th century in Armenia. They're not late translations. And recently, another scholar and I have completed and submitted for publication a translation of the Armenian version of the letters, which is actually fascinating because what it points to is ongoing monastic adaptation of the literary corpus to suit its perceived needs at the time, which is fair enough. That's what people do.
Now, is that other scholar? Are you talking about Columbus Stewart? Is that
no? Okay. No, this is of the Armenian.
Okay.
This is of the Armenian version of the letters.
Okay.
So that version, that translation, and it's not just a translation, it's also an adaptation, is actually probably produced in Armenia on the basis of a Syriac translation of the letters, probably in the 11th or 12th century. And it is part of a renewal of monastic life along Evagrian lines at the great monastery of Nareg, near Lake Van. So there were 2 great monastic thinkers, Ananya Shiragatsi, and of course, the very well-known Gregory Naregatsi, who are both deep theological thinkers, but Gregory more than the other one, although the other one is good. They're deep monastic thinkers, and they draw on these sources that had been passed along since the 4th century. I mean, that's a whole different course of cultural development,
right?
And it's really fascinating.
So
what the Armenian does is to turn the letters into a correspondence between Evagrius and Melania, as between a sort of male monastic expert and his female disciple, which is actually ironic, but there you go.
So they almost turn them into a series of dialogues almost.
Exactly. They turn them into a dialogue.
So you characterize Evagrius as kind of the scholarly form of monasticism, which I wanted to follow up with what you were talking about before and Evagrius's scholia. So Evagrius doesn't have any what we would call biblical commentaries, but he's got these scholia. What are scholia, and how do they differ from Origen's commentary on Matthew, for example?
Good question. I believe that that Evagrius modeled his scholia on 2 different eras of, or maybe genres of, literary philosophical conversation, for lack of a better word. The more proximate one to him are the interpretive sentences of why am I forgetting this man's name? You can edit this out. Plotinus' student.
Porphyry.
I'm blotting his name out. That's probably
right?
That's my demon. Yes, I know. And he was a Syriac speaker too. But anyway, so wicked me. But so he modeled some of his work on the aphormai of Porphyry. But more distantly, he's I believe the first Christian scholiast, depending on when Didymus did his. Okay, so they're happening together. They model their scholia on actually Greek scholia, perhaps too, for instance, the Homeric canon.
Yeah.
So they are a way, and of course, as we know, Porphyry did this too, but they are a way of interpreting at a higher level the encoded tales that we find in Homer, right? So that when you read Homer, you can proceed from the level of emotion and passion to the level of contemplation that lifts your mind higher, right? So, as I said, this has been going on for a long time in Alexandria, the creation of scholia, but Evagrius introduces it into Christian discourse. And this is his largest work. is the scholia on all the 4 wisdom books. Job,
right. So Proverbs, right?
Psalms.
He's got scholia in the Psalms, doesn't he?
Yes, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And it's a graduated, it's a ladder, right? So you're starting with Psalms and moving up the ladder, or maybe Job and moving up the ladder. There aren't many left of the scholia on Job. Moving up the ladder to the, if you can believe it, to Ecclesiastes, which is the highest level, as allegorical interpretation reveals, because who is Ecclesiastes but the assemblyman, taking ecclesia as assembly, and that, of course, is Christ. So since Christ is the one who gives these directions, they must be encoded in a sort of parabolic form that makes the mind of the devotee, of the person who's devoted himself it makes him work to understand what the real meaning is.
So there's a little bit of a reworking there then of Origen, who in his prologue to the commentary on the Song of Songs, he lists the 3 books from Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then the Song of Songs, with the Song of Songs being the pinnacle of contemplative theology.
Right.
But Evagrius kind of has a bit of a different trilogy, or a different, I guess,
right.
trivium almost.
He has occasional references to the Song of Songs, but he switches it out. And why he does that is a matter of speculation, because he doesn't tell us.
So the scholia then, do they reflect anything that's going on in the classroom potentially, or are they more Evagrius's thoughts that occur to him as he's working through the text himself? What do you think is going on with those?
Well, that's a good question. It seems, if Evagrius was a teacher in Egypt, as he is alleged to be, it's quite likely that he was also teaching earlier. But he could have been a private teacher, just the way Gregory Nazianzus was a private teacher. Recently, a very eminent scholar of Evagrius named Gabriel Bunge has advanced the theory, which I'm actually rather partial to, that Evagrius was a student, along with John Chrysostom, of Libanius. And
the rhetorical school that he ran, the school of rhetoric there.
That's right. And the grammatical and rhetorical remarks that Evagrius makes in the Scholia, interpreting those wisdom books, I think upholds. It's a convergent argument in favor of that. But actually, Bunge bases his conclusion on the historian Socrates, who mentions An Evagrius as a co-student of John Chrysostom in the school of Libanius, but doesn't connect John Chrysostom with the monks. And the argument is he just didn't want to, because he didn't like Chrysostom. That is the historian didn't. But there's an elaborate 2-part article on this subject. And I will just say, since this is, will be available on YouTube, that anyone who wants an up-to-the-minute bibliography should go to evagriusponticus.net, maintained by my colleague Joel Calvis-Mackey, who is one of our team members working on this translation of the trilogy. And there you can find every recent article on Evagrius, including this article by Bunge, which proposes a new biographical detail. To me, it makes a lot of sense, but we don't have it from Palladius, and Palladius has been the main witness, has been accepted as the witness to his life. Clearly, he lived a long time before he went to Egypt, and I doubt that he was just twiddling his thumbs, so to speak.
Okay, so bringing up Chrysostom is important, and I want to get to that later. But
Mhm.
when we read Evagrius the monk, then we have to read him through this lens of somebody who's very well trained in Greco-Roman philosophy and probably rhetoric. And he brings that mindset with him into the desert of Egypt. Now, there's that Samuel Rubinson, right, who has really argued that these Egyptian monks weren't just rustics. Anthony was very well versed in philosophy too. So there is something, in Egyptian monasticism, at least in, I guess, what would it be? It would be Lower Egypt, where Evagrius was, right? Where there was this this very learned form of monasticism, kind of in the,
Yes.
they're called Origenists, right? Many of them are, not all of them, but many of them are.
Yes, they're often by their detractors.
That's right.
And as you know, in the ancient world, people generally don't footnote. So,
Mhm.
so Evagrius doesn't say, I got this from Origen or I got this from Clement.
Mhm.
But sometimes you can find word for word adoptions
Mhm.
of those earlier thinkers. So this is a diadoche, a school tradition that is going on in Egypt. It gets disrupted briefly under Theodosius.
Mhm.
I mean, not Theodosius, Theophilus.
Theophilus, the Bishop of Alexandria.
Yes.
Mhm.
And but it also gets preserved. There are later writers in Coptic who are still using the thought of Origen. For instance, the Benedictine scholar Mark Sheridan has written a lot about Rufus of Shotep, who was a later, I think, 6th century Coptic author who is clearly quoting Origen. So Shenute didn't manage to destroy the Origenists.
Thank God.
And sorry.
Thank God.
Yes. And the tradition, Origen already is passing into the tradition with Athanasius and Eusebius. And then his library is preserved until the 7th century in Caesarea, and people are consulting it. Gregory Nazianzus, for instance, is thoroughly Origenian, but with his own, at like the structure of his thought. Of course, he adds other things, has a different style, but Origen was the great problem solver of early Christian thinking, right? And for instance, how it is that the Old and New Testament fit together, how it is that philosophy anticipates Christianity. So if you read his Contra Celsum, that's obviously his work. And you can say, well, yes, Origen was continuing the thought of Clement, who was continuing the thought of Philo. Once that school kind of incorporates Plato and Aristotle and Stoic ethics, it's very difficult to impossible to extract it from Christian thought. Not that I would want to, but so there are ructions and disagreements about particular points, but it's still central. And the great proof of that is Dionysius the Areopagite.
Yeah. So before I hit the record button here, you were telling me that you had just gotten done reading Origins on Prayer in Greek with Joseph Trigg. Now, Evagrius also has a treatise on prayer, and he says a lot about prayer. Are there overlaps between those two? Was Origins on Prayer something that was influential for Evagrius?
Well, yes, but Evagrius is a proud man. Despite his, I'm sure he was, despite his, warnings against pride as one of the vices. And and he wants to create his own work. And he has a reason for writing in short sentences. And so his work on prayer is organized into 153 short sentences, under a mystic number. He is, there is a strong conceptual relation between the two. Actually, Joseph Trigg and I are giving matched papers at the Origin Conference in Münster, or virtually in Münster, we don't know yet, on precisely this topic. So what's the relationship between these two? But this new genre that Evagrius uses, because of course scholia and kephalaia aren't really so different, are they now? He's doing that for a particular purpose, and as he adapts Origin into scholia or kephalaia, he might add some of his own, the newer developments in his own thought, particularly where he has to respond, as I said, to Porphyry, but also he's, interestingly, maybe not so much in On Prayer, but in other works, he's also responding to Mani, whom Origin, whom Origin did not have the pleasure of living to see, but of course, there's a very strong, it's a very strong and persuasive form of religion that is also present in Syria and in Egypt, and as we know, in North Africa at precisely the same time. So I think, and it isn't maybe an accident that some Manichaean teaching is preserved as kephalaia, but these kephalaia also, Evagrius, who had medical training, as many people did, many well-educated people at the time, they are meant for rumination and healing, right? So it's a different form. It's a different literary form than the On Prayer, which is a treatise addressed to an advanced Christian man, Ambrose, and an advanced Christian woman, Tatiana, as a discourse about the meaning of the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
So I know you know that, but the On Prayer is something, it's similar but different because it's a different time, has a slightly different purpose, but it draws from Origin. So when our volume on Origin's newly discovered homilies finally comes out, I will have an article in that on how Evagrius interprets Psalm 76 in his Psalm Scholia, because Origin has homilies on Psalm 76 in the newly discovered manuscript. And you can see that he just tracks him all the way down in his Scholia on that psalm until the last Scholion, which is a Scholion about the number 4, basically. And there he simply quotes Clement.
So it's very possible then that Evagrius would have had access to Origen's homily, that homily on Psalm 76 that we have in the Munich Codex.
Yes, that's what I'm arguing. It doesn't look like a coincidence, does it? And if Gregory of Nazianzus had access to the Origin library, and in fact the Philokalia, which he may or may not have, people differ on this, written, then surely Evagrius as his student would also have had access to it and other Origin books that Gregory Nazianzen may well have had copied and brought back to Cappadocia with him.
So in the 10th conference of John Cashin's conferences, he's got that famous depiction of this scenario where the monks are reading Theophilus's festal letter, and Abba Serapion laments, and he says, what does he say? They've taken my God away from me.
Oh,
the image, or the subject there of this huge dispute, which is the Origenist controversy that Cashin is describing, is depicting God with mental representations at the time of prayer. So, the equivalent today would be like, does God look like George Burns or Morgan Freeman or something like that? Does God have a physical body like a human being? Now, Evagrius,
or like Oprah Winfrey.
or like Oprah Winfrey, whoever you want to depict God as. Evagrius has this very interesting kind of concept of pure prayer, which he calls, imageless. What's he doing there? Because it seems like there's almost a superficial reading of that would say, Evagrius is denying the body, but he must have been formulating that within these discussions about anthropomorphism, or am I off base there?
Well, that's a really good question. Evagrius is he is a Platonist, like everybody in that period who had a sort of speculative philosophy. So of course he believes that the one and the unity, that is God as one and Trinity, cannot be depicted in form or outline, right? He probably helped Gregory Nazianzus write his 5 theological orations. And Gregory says there, you can't depict God. And he also says that God is without number, so that when you say Father, Son, and Spirit, you're saying not 1, 2, 3, but 1 and 1 and 1. That's the basic framework of Evagrius's thought. I actually haven't, well, let me back up and say, at a certain level of thinking, images are perfectly fine. So you can have in your mind an image of something in the Bible, or you can have in your mind an image of the temple, and temple mystagogy is extremely important for him, very important, just as it was for Nazianzus and Nyssa. But that is supposed to lead you forward to a noetic, imageless, non-pictorial union with the one. And that's your goal, that's your destiny. It is the return to the one. So we could say, yes, this is a sort of Christian Timaeus or a Christian Plotinus, and we'd have to say, yes, it is, because that is the good and the beautiful, according to philosophically trained minds of late antiquity.
Now, the way Origen describes this process, he uses Matthew 5:8 as his biblical paradigm, and purity of heart, the concept purity of heart. Does Evagrius do that? Does Cashin does all over the place in his conferences? Does Evagrius make a lot of use of purity of heart?
Well, isn't he would probably say mind.
Okay.
So the simple mind or the clear mind, those are my translations, not his. There is, he uses the word, and we were just discussing this in our translation of the Kephalon Gnostico, because one of the challenges there is to figure out what is the Greek word behind the Syriac. So there is a description of the ascent of the mind. Well, okay, that's pretty standard. And the word is probably, the Greek word for shulafa in Syriac is probably anabasis. So the the mounting up of the mind, and as the mind mounts up, it leaves material objects and the pictures of material objects behind as it goes toward union with the one who cannot be pictured. And this, of course, is, I hope this isn't to reduce it to a cliche, but because the object is to know God. And that is, of course, that's what the Gnostikos is about. Who is the Gnostikos? It is the one who knows God. To know God, you must be a friend of God. And friends are like each other, as Aristotle says. Friends must be equals. So the object of all of Evagrius's work is to make possible the return, the promotion, the rising up of the mind to God, so that like knows like. And this is a very happy process. I mean, the process is tough, but the outcome is happy.
Right. So this is a very Platonic Evagrius, but you also mentioned earlier that he had quite a bit of Stoicism in him too. And I wonder, one of the things that always strikes me when I read Evagrius, he has a very keen insight on psychological processes that would rival any modern cognitive behavior therapist. Now, that must
right there.
What's that?
I said he's right there with cognitive psychology. You got it.
He is. It's so fascinating to hear what he has to say about that. And I think there's so much that we can talk about that can cover hours on this subject. But on the one hand, one thing that strikes me is, so he's got the 8 principal thoughts that eventually make their way into Latin as the 7 deadly sins.
Yes.
But another thing that Evagrius seems to be dealing with when he talks about these things is how these thoughts manifest in our human relationships. It seems like they're always trying to grapple with monks not getting along with each other in a sort of way. I don't know. That must be because, the Stoics said that doctrine of ikiosis, right? Or kind of responsibility, social responsibility. Is Evagrius kind of in the Stoic playground when it comes to his psychology and his ethics?
Yes, I think the Platonists had by his time largely adopted Stoicism. They don't believe in Stoic metaphysics, so they just ignore it. And to practice as Stoics practiced, to restore balance in the self, that is what prepares you to learn. So that's sort of elementary school. And then you can learn, you can make accurate observations because you are not personally invested in the outcome, so to speak. You don't want to tip things one way or the other. You are not a neutral observer, but a loving observer. And Evagrius, as one of our happy band of 5 Evagrian translators would say, Luke Dysinger, Evagrius was trained as a medical doctor. And so he was aware of, he tended, especially in these more practical works, he tended to describe symptomata, right? The presenting appearances of mental or psychological problems.
What we would call today symptoms.
Precisely. And sometimes these symptoms required rough treatment. I mean, you can see that actually in the Gnostikos. Not rough, but treatment appropriate to getting rid of them. And that could be painful, as we know, just as the treatment of certain behaviors is painful. But the object is a kind of mental clearing so that love can take place.
Hmm.
His much despised by Jerome,
Yep.
apatheia,
Yep.
is really a settling down. It's very hard to translate that word. You could go with dispassion, you could go with calm, but it means the removal of disturbances.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the disturbances that keep you interested in a not good way
Mm-hmm.
in things in the world and in your own petty ambitions. We actually encountered this today, and we're not quite through reading on prayer, but we encountered this today in the long chapter 29 of prayer. I think it was in section 19, where Origen is talking about how Satan is successful with some people because he already knows their inclinations, right? So he's aware of, and I raise this about Satan, not because anybody particularly wants to hear about that, but Evagrius has a robust demonology, as does Origen.
Mm-hmm.
And this does not originate, of course, even, this demonology is very common in philosophy at the time, as it was in earlier Jewish Second Temple thought. So the combat with demons is the combat against those who know your worst side and want to exploit it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, this apatheia, that's kind of what gets his legacy into trouble, because I think people are worried that taken to its extreme, it can mean this complete detachment from any human emotion or affections whatsoever. Right. The way you're describing it is you're saying, no, that's not what Evagrius was saying. He was actually just saying having some control over them so that they don't, to put it crudely, that they don't disturb the person from his or her how to put it, his or her pursuit of knowledge or acquisition of virtue,
yes.
Human relationships, that they just don't get in the way. Like a good cognitive behavior therapist would say, you can't be without anger, but that doesn't mean that I mean, when you act on it, that's your choice, and you're then choosing to let that anger bother you and interfere with you. Whereas they might say, well, you can't
Yes.
get rid of it. You can choose to act appropriately and not let it rule you. I'm putting it really poorly.
Well, all of these so-called disturbances that we have are features of the soul united to a body. Mm-hmm. And you might say on one level, we need them, to protect ourselves, to advance or whatever. But if your purpose is return to God, they are an impediment.
Right.
And they must be calmed down and substituted, and love must enter as a substitute. And love cannot enter if you're constantly distracted by thoughts of this and that. And one of the things that has interested people most is acedia,
yep.
Which is sometimes translated as melancholy. That's a bad translation. Mm-hmm. It means slacking off.
Right.
Not doing your job, like staring out the window instead of paying attention to the aorist. Mm-hmm. And Evagrius has some funny things to say about that, because I bet he knew about that too.
Yes, I'm sure he did.
And so staying on task, mm-hmm. Not responding to thoughts by someone who has observed you, thoughts prompted by someone who has observed you and knows your weaknesses, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And so that's where the ethical part fits in, mm-hmm. and it can never be abandoned. You have, even while you're thinking, writing, praying, you must also always be on your guard against the logismos of whatever it is. And then sometimes he doesn't always stick to 8 thoughts. He has other thoughts too,
Yeah.
in different works.
Yeah.
But I think the PatristiCast he writes for monks so they can, count up to 8, or because 8 is a symbolic number or whatever.
Now, Acedia, yeah, that's a generic translation would be depression. I hear that a lot. There's a great book by a guy by the name of Andrew Solomon from, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, called The Noonday Demon. And he was,
Yes.
so you're familiar with that book? He's a psychologist who's writing about kind of the global perspectives of clinical depression.
Right.
Now, for the monks, of course, it's not, like you say, it's not just people who are depressed and sleep all day. It can manifest itself in a variety of way, procrastination, monks who, instead of tilling their field to grow their crops or copying their text, doing monastic manual labor, they were out commingling with each other to, avoiding basically doing their work because they couldn't sit still. I don't know. But what is, this is a really big question, but what is Evagrius's legacy in this regard? Because these insights that he has on human emotions and human behavior are so profound. What does he teach us today?
That's a good question. I think it's different. Different people could approach him different ways. I think for someone who's interested in ancient techniques of self-control and illumination, they would find in Evagrius someone very similar, but on the Western side of the map, to certain forms of Buddhism. And this is confirmed for me by the conversation I once had with a Cistercian nun, younger than I. We talked about Evagrius, and I said, some people said he was a Buddhist. And she said, oh, he was. I know, because I was a Buddhist too. So I think there's a kind of general application, and that the method that Evagrius discovered is a kind of universal method fitted to human cognition, and different people discovered it at different times. I think for a historian of philosophy, Evagrius is a really interesting example of the application of 4th century Platonism in a particular vein. He's an example of a conversation that is going on. He's also a very interesting, well, for me anyway, exegete, who is extending the exegesis of, as I said, Philo, Clement, and Origen into a new time period for purposes that I think we still don't completely understand. I don't think he has in mind tilling fields. I would go back to that because I think it must be said that he was a child of great privilege. And it's no doubt that if his father was a bishop, he was a wealthy man. Not Evagrius, but his father. And he has in mind being a scholar and teaching other people at a very high level. I think, though, for someone who is interested both intellectually and maybe even more personally, I don't mean that intellect isn't person, but Evagrius offers a highly flexible mode of insight that actually you do find can be applied to your own thinking patterns.
Hmm.
Um, and and he offers the possibility of multiple interpretations of scripture, which I think is also very interesting because um, of course that is such a polyvalent
Mhm.
collection.
Mhm.
That is and when I say scripture, I mean, of course, the Septuagint and the Greek New Testament.
Yes.
Evagrius is something different when he's translated into Syriac. I have a translation coming out at some point soon, I hope, of his letters, which are preserved only in Syriac, except for some fragments. That's a different cast of Evagrius, you know. So he was very important for the Syriac tradition. And again, he looks different in Armenian. And since I, alas, never learned Arabic, I don't know how he looks in the Arabic tradition, but I'm hoping that will also be published. I also think that he's a very interesting example of the Christian engagement with Second Temple Judaism, because if I may say this, the noumenal temple was so important to him. He understands the temple as sort of the noetic representation. So the temple, not its stones and so forth, but the temple understood intellectually is something that he gets from earlier Jewish tradition, and he has deep respect for it. I want also to say that a great thing about Evagrius is I have only found one anti-Jewish remark in his entire corpus so far, which for the 4th century, I think is actually, admirable.
Well, you got John Chrysostom, right, who has more than...
yes, if John Chrysostom was his fellow student, but John, you see, became a bishop.
Yeah.
And bishops, with all due respect to my own, bishops fight.
Yeah.
They have to.
Yeah.
And someone who has a very good library in a monastic dwelling in Egypt doesn't necessarily have to fight except with the unseen.
He's not competing for missionary purposes with his...
He's not fighting for territory.
Yeah.
And he's not trying to reform the lives of, by his own light, the lives of people who are, just beginning to become Christian and get interested in what it all means. I mean, look at the harsh remarks that John Chrysostom sometimes makes to his congregation. Nothing against John, but he had an uphill battle, right?
Yeah.
Evagrius doesn't. He has a kind of community, I wager, not so different from Plotinus's Platonopolis, except it's Christian.
All right. Well, what a wonderful way to end, because I think you said you had to go at 4:15, and we're almost at...
Yes, I do.
So this was a very delightful conversation.
For me too, thank you.
Evagrius is such an interesting figure. I wish more people had a chance to read him, because he's got some profound insights into the human mind and the human heart. So,
John, could I just mention at the end that I think that's true. I hope that the work that I'm doing, that others are doing, will make him more widely known. And I don't think I would ever have understood Evagrius, even at the relatively superficial level I understand him, without the companionship of the 5 of us who are producing the translation, and that would be Columbus Stewart, Luke Dysinger, Joel Calvis-Mackey, Charlie Stang, and myself. And we hope to have that translation ready, maybe not more than 5 years late.
And it's CUA Press, is that right? Is that where it's going to be?
No, that one will be Oxford. The letters are Fathers of the Church.
Okay.
So.
All right, very good. Well,
okay.
I look forward to them very much. And thank you very much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to to speak with you about someone who, has pretty much taken over the last decades of my life, probably on Earth.
Well,
Okay,
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I certainly did. So
thanks a lot, John.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks at our conference.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.